Hello, I'd like to welcome everyone to the Littleton City Council study session for, was it May, what is today's date, 12th, 2020. Full council is here, plus the city manager, city attorney, and some other staff. We have one item on our agenda tonight, and that is, what is it? ID number 20-131, financial update. And city manager, Mark Rolfe.
All right, thank you, Mayor. Good evening, Council. Actually, I think I'm just going to turn it over to Tiffany Hooten, our Finance Director. As the Council knows, this is our real first opportunity to look at some sales tax data, and we'll talk through what that means here at this point in time. It's only really kind of a partial picture here because the data really is only from March, which really that's the beginning of the whole COVID-19 began in the middle of that month. But actually, there's some detail here that's pretty interesting, and we'll talk about what this means in a forecast. So with that,
and if I could just chime in, I would. Tiffany's presentation isn't very long, so if maybe we could hold off on our questions until she's through, because some of the questions may be answered. But no, the presentation is not very long. Tiff is always willing to get through this thing quickly, so if we can hold our questions.
Okay.
Sure, thank you. Good evening, Council. I'm going to go ahead and share my presentation. Here we go. All right. So we're going to give you just a little bit of an update of where the city is financially. With COVID, really trying to understand what our sales and use tax revenues are looking like are going to be crucial to making plans for the future. So we'll go over our April sales and use tax revenues. I believe I sent that report out to council, so hopefully you've had a chance to kind of glance through that, but I'll highlight a couple of things that we saw with the April sales tax revenues. And then we're gonna look at some 2020 revenue estimates, and then we'll translate that into some 5-year financial plans. And then we'll talk a little bit about what measures we've taken here at the city so far and where we might be looking towards in the future. So when we look at the sales and use tax revenues, Mark mentioned all of the April revenues that we've collected are mostly for March sales. Now, March was 2 weeks under the stay-at-home order, so there's definitely some impact to our revenues. The other part that is included in April revenues are some filers who file quarterly. So there are some filers who remitted taxes in April that are for January through March. So it's not a full representation of the month of March related to COVID, but it gives a good idea of what we're looking at. So I want to just compare April 2020 to April 2019. You can obviously see retail sales tax are down. We expected that. Use taxes are down, and I'll kind of talk to that a little bit. And then motor vehicle taxes are down. All of these things were anticipated. We knew that we were going to have reductions. We just wanted to know what the true picture of that was for the month of March to help us kind of guide what April sales and June sales or May sales might look like for the city. If you look year to date, it's actually much better than I had thought as well. Year to date, so that's January through April collections, retail sales tax was actually up, be it less than 1%. It still is up year to date. General use taxes are down 41%, and then motor vehicle sales are slightly down less than 1%. So I kind of want to talk a little bit about the retail sales versus general use versus motor vehicle. Retail sales, are based on just taxable sales throughout the city and outside the city and the state. Those are the ones that we really want to watch closely because they're the majority of the tax revenues for the city. General use taxes are more when businesses buy equipment or expand maybe their building and have to add software, things like that. So it really varies depending on what businesses are doing. And that one is probably the most difficult to project for going forward. I know you've seen graphs that I've done that it really goes up and down depending on the businesses. And we have to rely on businesses to report that and remit that to us. And motor vehicle taxes are actually, you know, when you purchase a vehicle, and with the uncertainty of jobs with the majority of the population right now, I do anticipate motor vehicle taxes to go down simply because people might be less apt to purchase vehicles. And I think a few other things that I want to kind of highlight when we talk about sales and use tax revenues is, you know, what percentage of our sales and use tax revenues come from what industry? Because that'll kind of guide, as I mentioned earlier, that'll kind of guide us into what we think our projections will be. It's no secret that in Littleton, our retail sales tax is definitely the largest percentage of our tax revenues. You know, we have Aspen Grove, and you can tell Aspen Grove went down significantly for March, you know, more than 50%. And it's probably even going to go down, I believe I estimated 5 to 10% for the month of May collections. And that's simply because they've been closed. And understanding what percentage of Aspen Grove is in relation to our total taxes for, let's just use 2019 as a gauge on what percentage. Aspen Grove is roughly, let's see, what do we have here? Aspen Grove is roughly 10% of our sales tax revenues. Making sure I got that right. Yeah, 9 to 10% of our sales tax revenues. So, you know, it's really important that we get the retail businesses back up and running here in the city under these new guidelines, because that definitely is a high percentage of our revenues. The other part is food and accommodation. So that includes our restaurants and our hotels. And for the month of April, those went down pretty significantly. You can see it went down about 34% compared to April of 2019, which again, we anticipated the decline in the revenues for that as well. One thing that we do watch is we watch our top 10 companies by geographical location in the city. And we also watch our top 10 categories or top 10 companies for our industry sectors. And just kind of a reference point for our geographical areas, it's about 130 companies that we kind of watch. And for the month of April, they were down 9%. And for the industry, the top 10 of the industry companies, they were down about 14%. And again, I would anticipate those to go down fairly significantly for the month of June or May collection. Sorry, I keep getting my months mixed up. I think one thing that was really interesting in on our March or April collections was what types of industries actually had an increase versus which types of industries had a decrease. So, you know, retail definitely had a decrease, but one thing that we did notice, and you might imagine, is that grocery stores are showing an increase. And that's simply because, you know, they're one of the few that are open right now during this pandemic. And so we did see an increase in our grocery stores. The other areas that we have seen an increase are home improvement stores. We have a couple in Littleton that are bigger boxes, and they also were showing an increase. And I think, again, that's mainly because they're one of the few areas that are few stores that are able to be open during this. I think one thing that we want to keep in mind too is, looking at our mix up of our taxpayers. There's times where we're fortunate that we don't have big boxes, and there's times when it's unfortunate that we don't have big boxes. And I'm talking like Macy's and Kohl's, some of those larger companies. If we relied on sales tax from those larger companies right now, we might have a different story, or we might be looking at a different situation. But we don't have those. So sometimes, just looking at the history of the declines and the recessions that we've had, Littleton's actually been fairly resilient to those compared to other cities. And I firmly believe that part of that is because we don't have those big boxes. So we kind of weather the storm when it comes to recessions. Looking back at 2008 and 2009, we did have one year where we had a decline, but it was only about 4 to 5% of a decline. And that was the lowest or most decline that we've had since 2005. And so I think that kind of shows that, we've had a few other years where it might have been down 1% or 2%, but even during the recession of 2008 and 2009, our retail sales tax showed we were only down 4 to 5%. So I'm hoping that that's going to kind of help us in Littleton weather through this, because we do have that. The one thing that is newer to Littleton, most recently because of the Wayfair decision, is we have a number of online companies who have voluntarily registered and are collecting and remitting Littleton taxes. And we monitor the larger, more well-known online companies. And one of the questions that we were asked is, what percentage or what dollar amount do our online companies bring in? And of the larger ones that we do monitor, for 2019, it was about $650,000. And again, that doesn't include all of the smaller ones, but definitely some of the larger ones. And that's another area that we did actually see an increase in April collections were online companies. And again, that's mainly because that's an avenue for people to do their shopping right now while these retail agencies or retail companies are closed. So it kind of follows some of the things that we had anticipated. And actually, I think overall for April, I feel like we're in a much better spot than we had anticipated, which is kind of helping guide where we're going in the future and over the next couple of months as well. We're going to continue to watch the May collections to see how they really fare. And when we get into some of the detail on the projections that I have, I'll kind of show you what I'm anticipating or expecting. And, I'll put a big caveat on that we really don't have any good, clear guidance or direction of where we're headed. So we're looking at where we are today, what we anticipate we're going to be at over the next few months to kind of give us a guide and an idea of adjustments that we might need to make on the way. So when we look at our 2020 revenues, the one thing that, the biggest question is, what is the impact going to be? We know there's going to be an impact, but how much of an impact? And so I came up with 3 scenarios, and it ranges from 11% decrease in revenues to a 24% decrease in revenues. And this is between 5 million and almost 11 million in potential lost revenues. And, it really just depends on how each month comes in. For example, for the next month, for May collections, I've actually anticipated in different scenarios that we could have a 35% reduction, a 70% reduction, or a 75% reduction. And for scenario A, what I looked at was what were our collections in April, what percentage of each classification, was it up or was it down? And I kind of adjusted that to account for what I felt was more accurate or more reasonable. And I think with scenario A, it's the most aggressive or most hopeful, the best scenario, I would say. And like I said, that's based on where we came in for April collections and what how I feel we're going to be for April and in the out months. Scenario B is what I consider most likely or most probable, and that's much more conservative, and that's applying some more reductions over the next few months and kind of smoothing out the third quarter and fourth quarter, not coming back to full capacity or full expectations in those last two quarters, just to kind of push out the smoothing effect, if you will. And then scenario C is the most conservative, and that one is, in the third and fourth quarter, not expecting revenues to come back to at least where we budgeted. We're looking at 20 and 10% reductions even through November and December based on our budget. And so I feel that one is the most conservative. Some other pieces are general use and motor vehicle. Again, I've ratcheted those up as far as what percentage we're going to lose over the next over the next year. And again, use tax is dependent on businesses. If the economy comes back and it's pretty vibrant, maybe companies will continue with replacing equipment or furniture or moving forward with those things. And that's what we're hoping will happen. But we have to plan for that not to continue. And that's what scenario C is taking into consideration. Again, with motor vehicle, as the unemployment rate continues to remain low, and it's going to take a year or so or more for that to come back up. Again, I feel people are going to be reluctant or conservative in their own purchases and not buying vehicles. And in each scenario, I have 20% reduction in other revenues, and that would include court fines and charges for services. And I left that the same for each scenario, just to kind of keep that even, because we just don't know where those revenues might land. And so I think when we're talking about scenarios, I honestly hope I am like a meteorologist and I'm wrong the majority of the time, and I'm hoping that we will fall under scenario A, but we definitely are planning to address reductions in services and programs for scenario B and even into C over the next few months to few years. I think we also need to understand that even with these large numbers of lost revenue for 2020, we don't have to account for all of this or make up these differences in 2020 or one single year. That's one thing that we have fortunate for us in Littleton is we have a fairly healthy fund balance in 2020. And so we definitely have reserves that we could use. I think the one thing that we need to understand and keep in mind is our fund balance percentages at the end of year 5 on our 5-year planning. And I think that's why, we're not required or it's not necessary for us to make any changes or reductions in just in 1 year. We can certainly talk about the 2021 budget and the 2022 budget and make adjustments as it goes. And I think until we have a true picture of the next few months, that's what we are planning on doing. So when I talk about reserves, we do have reserves in 2020, and this is just a snapshot. So our policy, as I mentioned, is 8 to 18% at the end of year 5. With scenario A, we would be at 15% without our reductions. For scenario B, we would be at 10.3% without our reductions. And for scenario C, 2.3%. And again, that would be if we were to deplete our fund balance in 2020 and not make any adjustments. So we have already taken measures here at the city to mitigate lost revenues. And so in the council communication, I also provided percentages of what the fund balance will look like at the end of 2020 with our 2.1 million that we've already identified and implemented for reductions. And so in comparison, under scenario A, we're at 20.8%, and at scenario B, we're at 15.9%, and at scenario C, we're at 7.5%. So I just want to provide that information as a comparison of where we would end at the end of 2020 if we didn't do anything under each scenario, and then if we incorporated our 2.1 million in reductions. So when we look at our 5-year financial plan, this is what is the unknown, I have to say. Not knowing what our revenues are going to look like in 2021, not knowing what they're going to look like in 2022 and beyond. And I've provided some scenarios to kind of guide some discussion in the future as what to know what that would look like. So I have in the council communication, I have projections A, B, and C. And it goes from best case scenario to worst case scenario. If we left all of our revenues as we had originally planned in our 5-year plan when we created the 2020 budget, that's what projection A is looking like. And you can tell by the percentages of projection A that they don't necessarily align with our policy after year 22 and 23. And then you can tell with projection B, which is what I would consider more realistic, where we have 0% increase in 2021 and then slight increases over the next few years. Again, it doesn't align with our policy in the out years. And then what I would call the worst case scenario, which is projection C, that one really comes into play in year 3. So 2022 is where we definitely aren't aligned with our fund balance policy. Now I know there's some negative numbers in there and it looks very dismal, but I think that's why we have to plan over the next few months and the next year to really address that. And without knowing what our revenues are going to look like, we certainly don't want to make any decisions or changes today that we may or may not have had to make. And so that's why we're going to continue to watch our sales tax revenues, see where we're headed. I'm going to update the projections monthly, definitely continue to watch our revenues so that we can make these adjustments throughout the next few months and years. So I kind of touched on some measures that we have taken. I mentioned 2.1 million. So these are some of the measures that are included in that. We did our reduction of 1.1 million, and that was citywide. We identified some areas throughout the city that we either could eliminate or reduce based on our current position. Some things in there, for example, our electricity and our street lighting bills. we kind of looked at our street lighting budget, looked at the last 5 years, and made some more realistic projections in our 5 years related to that. We also reduced a number of professional consulting contracts or projects that we had anticipated. The communications department had a couple of plans that they had wanted to move forward with this year, and so we eliminated those. Some other areas are, reduction or suspension of temporary employees throughout the city. And then, of course, the elimination of market increases for 2020, the suspension of the 2% match in our 457, and the library, museum, and a few others are currently on furloughs. And then a freeze on vacant positions other than necessary positions that are necessary, for example, the police department or maybe even dispatch. So I feel like we have taken a number of measures this year already, and in anticipation of the revenue decreases. So I feel like we're in a good place today. And when we come back and look at and share the May collections for sales tax, we'll definitely update our projections, and hopefully we're on par with where we want to be. And if not, then we will certainly look at additional measures that we can take. I think in conclusion, it's inevitable that there's going to be a loss of revenues. This is expected. Littleton is not alone. It's statewide, it's nationwide, it's global. There's just going to be a loss of revenues, and what that amount is really going to come to us the next few months. I mentioned our May tax collection will provide more insight. We've already taken measures that have put us in a better position today than we would have been had we not addressed any of them. And so I feel at this time there's no action needed. And once we look at May revenues, sorry, I keep messing up my months. Once we look at May revenues, then we'll certainly have a better picture and a better idea. But we're certainly not going to have all the answers. It's going to adjust. We're going to have to move along with the economy. I don't know if anyone has seen, but the April report showed that our unemployment rate nationwide is 14.7, which is the highest that it's been, I believe, since 2008. They do expect that it's going to come down. They feel that we hopefully have hit the peak, but we just don't know. I think one thing that the feds have tried to do is reduce interest rates. They're at zero. They're anticipating them to stay at zero to help stimulate some of the economy after all of this. Is that going to be all that's needed? Definitely not. I think the state put out a report just today where they're anticipating a reduction of revenue of 7.4%. And I know in history, looking back at the city, I mentioned that we kind of were able to get through these recessions better than some others. And I feel like we've been even better than the state. So unless the state comes back and makes some drastic changes in their projections, I'm hoping that we'll be in line with them, if not better, when at the end of the year and in 2021. I think one thing that is definitely going to come into play is when we talk about our 2021 budget. I mentioned in our communication that we would have already started our 2021 budget and we had already begun looking at it, but with this economic recession that we're in right now, it really has changed our plan and our calendar for our 2021 budget. We hope to send out information to departments in June to provide them with some guidance and direction for the 2021 budget. And then coming back to council in August or September, I think normally we come in September, And so trying to have a plan for the 2021 budget so that we can present it to council, knowing that it's just a plan and it's subject to change, and depending on the economy, some of the things we might include in the 2021 budget, we may have to readdress or address at a later date, depending on how that comes forward. But it's really challenging right now for staff and for citizens and for everyone to really understand how this is going to play out and how it's going to impact them and the city. I mentioned our 2021 budget. We had a plan originally. We ended 2019 better than we had anticipated, and we had some plans of some things that we wanted to move forward with, and I think we just have to reprioritize and understand what we can and can't provide going forward based on our tax revenue losses. I do feel that there is maybe some hope at the federal level. There's been several attempts to get funding for local municipalities, and they haven't been successful, but I do feel that they're going to keep trying, and there's going to be an opportunity, hopefully in the future, to help address some of the lost revenues, because it's just such a large, overwhelming number that I feel like there is hope, and there's going to be some help for local municipalities. I think with that, I'll go ahead and conclude my presentation, and certainly I'm sure you have questions, and if we didn't address anything, if you want to talk, if you have any particular questions or have any specific things you want to discuss, please let us know.
Great. Mark, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, maybe a couple of things. So I think the overall news here is clearly it's not good news, but I think it's a little bit better than what we had anticipated. Tiffany talked a little bit about the 2021 budget process. I know I've talked with council a little bit individually about this. We'll do our best, obviously, all of us together here, to come up with what we believe is probably the best estimate here for 2021. Clearly, what we're going to have in our back pocket is a series of actions that we can take as we move into the late end of the year, and certainly the first quarter or two of next year. So if the economy does not respond well, then we're positioned here so that we can act quickly. I do think that, again, there's probably some level of good news. There's all sorts of other concerns I've got in the capital project fund. Tiffany talked about use tax, the highway user tax, that's the state gas tax. The two of those is really what funds our capital projects here, plus the $3 million transfer from the general fund for street maintenance. I think a lot of cities are certainly very concerned about transportation projects and cities' ability to kind of meet our obligations and matches. I've heard that in about every city manager I've talked to here, certainly in our state. I know that it's a national issue and a national concern. So I think the transportation piece of this thing, as it plays out over time, will be pretty interesting for us and really for the nation. We definitely have challenges. Again, next month is probably the next best glimpse of where we're going. I also believe that we're going to probably have to look at some structural changes here to the organization in order to meet the real demands here for the 5-year plan. For us to simply just use all our reserves is just not responsible. We're going to have to make changes. We're going to have to focus on our real priorities of this organization and this community and just realign that. And that will start here this summer.
Great. Thank you, Mark. Let's go ahead and open it up to questions here in a second. I think one of the good things about all this is that this recession that we're going into is self-imposed versus something that just kind of happened we had no control over. So this is one where the government had to come in and shut things down for good reasons. But it is something that we can bring it back up. That it's not being held down by artificial stuff, as long as we don't wait too long anyway on that. So I think the unemployment, I heard in Colorado, is going to be this summer. I just heard it before the meeting started. It was going to be probably around 10%. So that's to be expected, I guess. And I think once we get going, that'll change quickly, I do hope. Let's open it up to questions. Who wants to go first? Mayor Pro Tem.
Tiffany, what percentage of our sales tax revenues come from restaurants and bars?
Yeah, so looking back at 2019, let's see what we have here. So for, where did I have it? Hold on. So hotel and accommodations, which includes restaurants and accommodations, which includes hotels, is at about 15%, if I recall. If you pull hotels out, it's about 14%. So hotels make up about 1 to 1.5% of our revenues in that area. So restaurants are about 14%.
And does that include bars?
Yes. Yeah, and I'm hoping that next month we'll be able to kind of refine that. I saw a report from another city that I think had some really good information that kind of breaks it out a little bit more. So I'm hoping that we'll provide that in our report next month, so that we can really have a little more defined idea of what is generating the sales tax.
Thanks.
Great. Pam, you have any questions?
Yes, Tiffany, I have a question on the 2020 general fund reserves. I want to make sure I'm reading it correctly. You have reductions based on loss of revenue, and then the different scenarios, those amounts relate to the overall 5-year reserves, the 6.9 million, the 4.8 million, the 1.0 million.
So that is the end of 2020 only.
Oh, okay.
Not the 5-year. For the 5-year, I put the percentages in the communication, in the council communication. So for example, at the end of 2024, if we have the best recovery that we expect, and we were collecting revenues like we originally had planned, at the end of 2024, we would be at 12.5%, which is well within our 8 to 18%. But it really is just going to depend on what our revenues come in at. Are they higher? Are they going to be lower? And so if you look at the worst case scenario for 2024, where we would see a reduction next year and no increases until year 4 and 5, we're well below zero, which we certainly would never allow the city to get to that point. We would definitely make changes over the next 5 years to counter that. So it shows a negative 25, but worst case scenario, without doing any more changes other than the 2.1, that would be worst case scenario. But again, it would be irresponsible for us to even remotely let the city get to that point. So we would definitely take measures, certainly in advance.
So for that slide, can you just say in a sentence what scenario A, 6.9 million, 15% of operating expenses, what is that saying?
So that's saying at the end of the year, we would have $6.9 million in our fund balance, which is 15% of our operations.
Okay. And the normal goal would be what percentage of operating expenditures?
The recommendation of any year is about 17%,
Okay.
Which is,
equates
to 2 months of operations roughly. But our policy allows 8 to 18%, and Tabor requires us to keep 3%. So if we were to continue and follow scenario C without making any additional changes, we would be below our Tabor requirement of 3% in 2020.
But scenario A and B fall within 8 to 18, so it's okay. All right. Thank you for the clarification.
Sure.
All right. Thank you very much. I do have one question, then we'll get to others too. On your third slide, where it's talking about the in comparing the 20 to 2019, as I recall, in 2020, we were anticipating growth of about $1 million.
Yeah, about 3%, 3.5% is what we are anticipating.
Or yeah, I think it was around 4.5%. I think is when I read the budget. So does that take into consideration then when we say that the loss in the percentages that you're having here, is it taking into consideration what we had projected, or is it just the hard numbers?
It's a hard number year over year.
Okay.
So if you look at overall through April, if you include retail sales tax, general use tax, and motor vehicle tax, we are down 3% year over year. However, the one that is the largest decrease is definitely general use tax, but general use tax varies so much that you could have a very good month. You could get $200,000 in 1 month from one company, or you might not get anything from that company. And so I'm not concerned about general use tax at this point, even though it is down from last year. I think if you look at the history, we have some large companies in the city that do a lot of technology replacements throughout the year, and it tends to be every 3 to 4 years. And so I'm hoping that will come in, and I feel like it will. And so I'm truly not concerned about general use tax at this point, even though it is down.
So there's two ways of looking at it then. One is to look at it just from the hard numbers year to date from last year. The other one is from our budget. So if we looked at it from the number from our budget, we're substantially down for 2 months.
3%, I wouldn't say is substantial because of the use tax piece. The use tax piece is $400,000 roughly.
Okay. Cool.
Which is the one that I was talking about that just, we can't predict it. We just don't know. We could have a really good month. We could have a really bad month.
Okay, so you're off on that. Who else has a question? Karina, you are muted. There you go.
Thank you. Tiffany, I have a clarification on the 14% you quoted earlier about restaurant accommodations. Was that 14% of the sales tax or 14% of the overall?
14% of the sales tax.
Okay. And then you touched on online sales. What is online sales? Same kind of the apples to apples versus sales tax. And what can be done, if anything, to continue to increase that, either tracking more companies, or is there anything that can be done to get a greater share of that?
Well, we're still limited because of a couple of things at the state level and at the local level. As a home rule city, we can't require companies that have online purchases to collect and remit. And so what we have been doing specifically since Wayfair is encouraging them. They're not required, but we do encourage them to register with the city and collect and remit Littleton sales tax. And at this point, that's really the only thing that we can do and promote to them. If we have a company call in, we definitely suggest that they collect and remit. As far as tracking, we can look at potentially looking at a different code. It gets a little tricky for online because they might be doing multiple things. They might have a storefront and online sales, and we certainly don't want them to have to remit 2 different returns to separate that out. And so that's kind of why we track the larger ones, to give us just an idea of what share. And as far as last year, I think I mentioned it was about 650,000 from those larger companies. So what does that come out to? 5% roughly or so, maybe less than that, 2%. Can't do that math in my head. But yeah, definitely the larger ones. I'm sure we're all familiar with which ones those are, namely it starts with an A. Yeah.
You made a comment, we encourage them, and what does encourage look like, and how can we encourage further? What are some other tactics?
Well, we have information on our website that kind of addresses the Wayfair decision, because a lot of companies, as a result of the Wayfair decision, they assumed that they were required to collect and remit in every jurisdiction, and it's just simply not the case in Littleton for a number of reasons, or in the state of Colorado. The state made a change, an emergency ordinance change to their state statutes to require companies, and any statutory city in Colorado that follows the state statutes related to taxes, they were allowed to require companies to collect and remit. But there's a number of reasons why we haven't done that, and why we are hesitant to do that, and why we want to work as a group for home rule cities to make sure that if we are going to look at changing our city code or any other ways that we want to do it collectively, to maintain our home rule status and allow us to keep that. And so there's a committee that's working on it. I think another piece is, the state is working on a software system, and I have a meeting tomorrow about it. They're working on it for a demo. They're working on a software system a universal software system, so that all companies can remit their sales tax at the state level. And that was one capability that Colorado doesn't have right now, that's part of Wayfair, is that it requires an alternative method or a streamlined way for businesses to remit sales tax in the state of Colorado for their online sales. And we didn't have that set up, but the state is working on that right now. So once that gets up and running, I think there'll be more discussions on potential changes at the local level if we want to do that. So when we say encourage, we provide information on our website that references the Wayfair, and we ask them to voluntarily collect and remit to make it, some of the discussion points are to make it equitable, so that people who are buying online are also paying a sales tax. But again, we can only encourage and we can't require, like I said, for a number of reasons. But if someone calls and they ask about online, we'll definitely suggest or ask that they and encourage that they collect and remit.
Great. Patrick, then Carol, then Kelly.
No questions.
No, nothing for you, Carol. Carol is muted. She's working on it. Oh, she might have froze up on us there. Kelly, how about, let's move on. Kelly, you have any questions?
I do. I have two questions.
Oh,
Tiffany, thank you. First, I want to thank you and your team for working so hard to pull this all together. I really appreciate it. I know that you and your team have been under a lot of stress, so thank you. My two questions. One of them is when I was looking through the expenditures, there was from 2019 to 2020, there was 171.4% increase in expenditures for city council. Do you know what that's from or why? I didn't know we were so expensive.
Go on to your next question and I'll see.
That's
Okay.
Probably for the DC trip. More members went this year than in the past.
Possibly, but
There was a reclass of some items that used to be under the city manager office that went under the city council. So it was a movement of some expenses from different budgets, I think.
yeah, it was the local partnership funding that used to be under the city manager's office, and that was moved to city council. And then also the town hall arts center funding, I believe that used to be in either city manager or gen ops, and that was moved to city council's budget as well.
Okay. It just sort of stood out to me, and I was a little perplexed as to why that's such a large percentage. The other question I have more relates to the state budget. I did too hear today on CPR that they are predicting a loss of revenues of 3.3 billion. And I want to know I know, in some ways how it's going to impact the city of Littleton. I'm quite certain it's going to impact ACC, our public schools. But is there any direct impact to us from that?
I'm trying to look to see if they listed any specific things. I think a lot of their reductions were related to school districts, school funding. So I think that definitely is going to impact LPS for us here locally. Some of the other areas I think that they mentioned were, was it healthcare? I'm sorry. I don't know. I don't know, Mark. There you go. Hand up.
I'll give you one example that I'm aware of. The gas tax, the Highway User Trust Fund. So as the taxes there become less simply because people are not driving as much, one of the first cuts the state takes is for state patrol. So they try to keep them whole. And so the balance that's left then is distributed down to the local governments. So I'm counting on the fact that we're going to get less in the gas tax. So Tiffany have to help me remember here. I think we get about 1.4 million historically.
Yep.
That really has gone a long ways to fund our street maintenance and other purposes here. But so that's one that clearly we'll probably feel that one.
How about Littleton Hospital? I know that Children's Hospital has already been impacted by all of this and expecting a big loss in revenue or in their budget. Do you know, has Littleton Hospital communicated anything to you, and how much of a role does Littleton play in our budget or revenues, or do they all?
I don't know that I have any information related to that. I'm assuming some of the reductions might come from Medicaid, possibly from the state, if they look at reducing the value of the claims for Medicaid patients. But I don't have any of that information.
Okay.
Good. All right. Let's get Carol's back. I'm sorry, Mark, did you want to chime in on that question?
Just quickly, I do know that prior to COVID-19, I had talked with some of the officials at Littleton Hospital. They had planned some expansion around the hospital. This has been a long-term goal of theirs. So I wouldn't be surprised that some of that has probably been put on hold as a result of all this, but that's probably my only known impact.
Yeah, and that could impact our building use tax, construction use tax, or our general use tax.
Great. Carol, I don't know if you're there again. Your picture went away on me. She's not. We can go back around the horn a second time there. Scott, did you have any other questions you want to ask? Okay. How about Pam? Did you have anything? Okay. Karina.
I do. I don't know if anyone recalls what was EchoStar's expansion plan as they moved to 5G here and have the headquarters in Littleton. And as I think about, the use tax fluctuations and what causes that, if they are buying equipment, would it be a use tax where the equipment is being used or where it's being bought from, because their overall headquarters is out in Centennial or Inglewood? So how does anyone remember when that expansion was planned and how some of maybe the use tax that would come out of that, would it be for Littleton or where the purchase procurement team is versus where the equipment ends up?
Yeah.
I don't recall any expansion per se. Are you thinking about physical expansion, about
no, more retooling, right? The equipment, the tools, the computers that, an engineering
right.
works,
I mean, they're
versus a call center workforce.
Gotcha. Yeah, they're going to be moving out their call center and bringing in engineers.
Right.
Approximately 150, I thought, somewhere in that vicinity. But yeah, I wasn't thinking so much in terms of equipment.
Yeah.
But so when they do buy equipment, who gets the use tax? That's a good question, Karina.
Yeah. So for equipment that they might purchase, if they purchase it and the equipment is in Littleton, they're required to pay a use tax. That's our general use tax. The counter to that is if they do buy it and they pay tax to another entity, and if that tax is equivalent to Littleton, then they would not be required to pay Littleton. We kind of give them a credit if they've paid another jurisdiction as sales tax in Colorado. The other part is if, let's say, for example, our sales tax is 3%, but they purchase and pay equipment from another city and their sales tax is only 2.5%, then the 5% difference is due to the city of Littleton for use tax.
Great. All right. I have, if you're through, Karina, I'm going to move on for a question for me then. So, Mark, I think you already addressed the adjustments. Just give me another idea of what you're talking about when you say you're going to make some adjustments, and I'm thinking that from the report on it was on page 5 where you were talking about that.
Well, I think I think obviously there's some things that are pretty unclear here as we just for this moment in time. I think when we have the meeting in June and kind of look at the next round of data for sales tax, I think some of the adjustments we could be looking at is, we've already furloughed 58 people. Some of those may be able to be brought back, and I'm thinking just using the library and the museum as an example. But just because of where we're at financially at the bottom line, we may have to look at, 3 days a week for the library and museum under some scenario, or maybe possibly for the balance of the year. Again, that's just speculation at this point. We've done a lot of work at the staff level looking at all sorts of scenarios with a 10% reduction, 20% reduction. I think that's what we're going to spend the balance of May is making sure that we kind of fine tune those estimates so that when we do get the report in June, that we're better positioned. I do think that the measures though that we've taken to date probably position us pretty well for June. So I don't see us taking any kind of significant steps, but it's the months that follow. And if there is some return to an economy that's more what we hope to be, maybe then that we can stabilize some of that pretty quickly. And so that maybe some of that change isn't as noticeable. But in the end, I still think that we're going to have a pretty tough challenge meeting the 5-year goals here. And so I do believe that we're going to have to go back and look at some of the priorities and just making sure that they are aligned. That's the whole purpose of why we've been pursuing priority-based budgeting. Because in the end, I think we are going to have to look at some structural changes, perhaps how the departments are organized, and reaffirm that the priorities that we've picked, that makes sense to the council. That's probably part of the 2021 budget process.
Cool. And Carol, I don't know if you're there yet or not. So I have another question. If Carol will just chime in whenever you get a chance. I do have another question on page 3 where you talk about the losses, how we're going to recoup them over the next several years. Does that mean we'll be using reserves to kind of carry us over as we recoup or grow the reserves back?
Yeah, I think that kind of goes back to when I was talking about, we don't have to make all the corrections in 1 year. We don't have to make up any shortfalls in 1 year because we do have some reserves. And that's why, we have an opportunity to make changes, structural changes, as Mark was mentioning, in, year 2021 and going forward to help mitigate those reserve or the losses that we've had, and to help maintain or potentially build up our fund balance back to an acceptable level.
So we have 22% that is unrestricted. What is our plan for growing that, getting it back?
Well, I think that's just going to depend on some priorities for council potentially. and what services we want to continue to fund, and are there any services that we might want to look at in discontinuing. There's always discussion of fees, again, aligning cost of services with fees. So I think there's a number of opportunities, both on the revenue side and on the expenditure side, that we'll definitely be looking at over the next few years.
Which was one more question, then we'll get back to Scott then and Mark. So yeah, when you mentioned, Mark, that you were going to have a service level reduction of multiple programs, is that, and that no doubt it's based partly on council goals and objectives, but it's priority based budgeting.
Correct. That's my intent here, is to obviously use the council goals and objectives and priority-based budgeting. I think the good news here is that I probably, as a city manager, I probably don't have to take action here in the immediate near term, and allow more of a discussion with city council to realign those priorities. I think here a couple of months ago, I was pretty worried that our sales tax returns were going to be pretty dismal. They're not great, but I think they're much better than we had anticipated. Therefore, we bought some time here for the council to really weigh in on kind of the next strategy.
And Scott?
Tiffany, how are our reserves held? I'm specifically thinking of a study session last year where the council was discussing investment options. And I'm wondering, if a significant amount of our reserves are sort of sitting in the stock market, do we risk losing some of those reserves simply because the stock market's losing value or something like that?
I think my initial answer would be no, and it's mainly because we're pretty diversified in our investments, and we don't typically take losses on our investments. We might take what I call a book loss. And clearly, everyone's familiar with what a book loss is. It's, the value of your asset in the market versus your actual loss or gain on it is what interest you receive. And, we're pretty diverse, like I said, in our investments. We're very conservative. We're limited in what we can invest in. We had a meeting today with some market analysts who kind of gave us some guidance for the next few months. Watching our investments that we have in corporations, there could be a downgrade potentially. I think that's one of the things that's kind of out there right now is the watch list on not only public companies, but also even municipalities and government agencies. They tend to be on a watch list right now. Over the last few months, we have had a lot of investments called. So we buy both investments that we hold to maturity, and then we also have some that if the market goes down, they can invest at a lesser rate, and so they call their money back or their investments back. So we've had a number of those happen, but we're also trying to reinvest in the long term to try to mitigate any interest losses. We're gonna lose some interest just because of the market right now. But as far as value of assets, I feel like we're very, we're covered in that area. I don't foresee us having to sell any investments or take any book losses at this time.
Good. Carol, I know you're back now. Did you have any questions, Carol? I tell you, we're not having any luck with her internet tonight. Karina.
I have one final question. When the CARES money comes in, is that, how do you account for that, Tiffany? Is that going to be accounted for as revenue, or is it just like a transfer in, transfer out? How do we think about that when we look at those numbers?
Well, we would likely count it just like a grant. So it'll be a revenue and an expenditure. We're kind of talking internally how we want to manage that. We have a separate grant fund that we try to keep all of that in. So we'll have all the expenditures go there and all the revenues or reimbursements come into that fund. So it, typically nets to zero. So that's kind of what we're looking at right now so that we can manage all the expenses that are related to that and what we get reimbursed for.
And do you know?
Yep.
Do you know if the requirement is going to be that it would be used in 1 year, or is that, let's just call it a $4 million number? We potentially could use it over a few years.
Currently, it is very clear that it's only for expenditures through December 30th of 2020. I would say that could be subject to change, just like a number of other things have been changing throughout all of this. But currently, it's only expenditures through December 30th, 2020.
Great. Patrick, did you have any other question yet? Any questions still? Okay, cool. Kelly, do you have anything again? Yes, okay.
So, Tiff, oh, sorry.
Okay, just 1 second. Did I hear Carol? No.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry,
I keep.
Sorry. Go ahead, Carol.
I keep getting disconnected, and so I'm just letting you know that I can kind of hear sorta, but I keep getting knocked off.
Yeah.
I'm working with top.
Did you have a question at the moment?
No, I don't have a question.
Okay, thanks.
What the heck's wrong with my bandwidth? That's
We're
my
keeping
question.
an eye on you. We're keeping an eye on you. Karina's been there, man. She can relate. Hey, I'm sorry, Kelly. We're back to you.
Tiffany, could you refresh with us what that money, the CARES Act money, can and cannot be used for?
I think that is almost a loaded question at this time.
Don't know.
Sorry.
We are still getting guidance from Arapahoe County and also from the Treasury who issued the money. They expect some more guidance to come out in the next few days. So I'm hoping that we will have more definitive answers in the coming weeks. But right now, I don't have a clear answer for that, but we are certainly working internally to identify expenditures that might qualify for that.
Yeah, and I would just jump in and say one thing that it can't be used for is to offset lost revenues. So that's what we can't use it for.
That much we know so far. Yeah.
That's
I do have
no.
Yeah. On our procurement policy, our policy is, I believe, is to buy first in Littleton, then Colorado, then elsewhere.
Well, we do have a provision in our policy that when we do bids or RFPs, if there are companies that the cost is fairly close, that we do prefer to use a Littleton company. And we do encourage our employees to buy local, specifically in Littleton if they can. I'm going to go back to our retail sales tax base. It's very different in Littleton. So there are a number of things that we just can't purchase locally, even with professional services and equipment. So we do have to look outside of Littleton, even Colorado, for some of our purchases and probably a majority of our purchases. But we certainly do have that provision, and we can continue to look at it closely.
Great, thank you. And I have a question for Mark then. So what projects has the city delayed or maybe even canceled? And a part of that, second part to that question would be because the county, for instance, they would like to know what programs have been canceled by the cities so that they know that there won't be any matching grants or something along that line. Have you had an opportunity to even get there yet?
Well, let's see. We've identified what I would say some projects within the general fund. In fact, Tiffany touched on a few of those. Communications had a couple of projects that they were looking at here. Right offhand, I can't remember what they were. But the larger projects, in fact, I was on the same conference call as you, Mayor. The ones that I think are probably at risk, or at least we need to look at very carefully, are the joint transportation projects, and County Line Road is probably one of the best examples of that. We also have the Santa Fe corridor, the PEL process. As far as I know, we've all paid our share for that study to begin. But that's one that we need to reaffirm that all the entities have paid their share. Let's see, Tiffany, I think I'm trying to remember some of the other projects. I do know that some of the street maintenance accounts, we've had to freeze some of that stuff so we could take a look at it. We've been slowly letting that go as the revenue within the capital project fund is kind of reaffirmed, but we're watching that one really carefully. I do have some concerns about our match for some of these larger transportation projects here in out years. We may be okay in the first year or two, but it's the out years that are going to be a real challenge. Mineral and Santa Fe, for example. I do have some strategies that I have begun to discuss with Tiffany and others about how we might meet that obligation. And that would be part of the council discussion here this summer and fall.
Great, thank you. Karina?
What about the building? There was, we were going to be using the impact fees for the building. That was a pretty big project. And I'm sure now those plans may be subject to reevaluation, just not knowing what office structures will look like in the future, right? So is there anything yet on that and where you're heading?
Well, that is actually a very good question because it does relate directly to the CARES Act. And I was going to provide a little bit of a briefing here for council and the city manager comments, but if you don't mind, Mayor, I'll just jump right in on this.
Well, if we don't have any more questions for Tiffany, let's move right into it. Seeing none, let's do it.
Okay.
Oh.
So the CARES Act, obviously we've been trying to keep council informed here, but this was a piece of federal legislation from a couple of weeks ago. It was targeted to population areas greater than 500,000. So in our state, you know, that was Denver, Jeffco, Adams County, and of course, Arapahoe County. And so the counties here in our area, we got Jeffco and Arapahoe County. Reed can probably backstop me on some of this here because both he and I have been working on this and both part of some conversations here on the topic. I had another meeting last Friday with county staff and area city managers. We talked through some of the detail of that. The update is that the county commissioners plan to act on a draft or an IGA, intergovernmental agreement, here on the 19th. Reed's part of a conversation around that. The allocation models, I've shared with council kind of a sheet that the county staff assembled that showed that Littleton would probably be looking at anywhere from 3 million to perhaps over 7 million. Based on the discussion with the city managers, it looks like the county staff's going to be recommending what they call the 55-45 split. That 55-45 was part of the initial legislation of the CARES Act. It kind of relates to a percentage that's state and a percentage that's local government. That was just part of the language of the legislation. So that means approximately 4 million. And so out of that, we have scheduled here a discussion with council at the end of May to allow staff some time to kind of analyze the framework for which we could spend the money and then make some recommendations for council to review and then provide direction here for staff. One of which, quite honestly, is how we might hardscape or change the 30 some odd buildings that the city owns. And so, Karina, you are correct. You know, originally here we had a project for the Littleton Center that was going to be taken on, you know, basically some capacity issues here for space. Well, now we're going to have to step back a moment here and kind of analyze the space completely different, because now we're trying to decide, well, where do we truly want public access and where does it make sense given the pandemic? And so the CARES Act definitely is focused around providing costs and relief around those kinds of areas. And again, we have over 30 buildings for which we have to kind of analyze and review. At some point, the impact fee for the Littleton Center may come back into play, but we got to sort out the CARES Act here first. The other thing I just want to mention about the
I noticed that Scott had a question.
Sorry, I don't, this is an important briefing, and you know, I know that I just want us to be a full council. Carol's trying to participate. I wonder if we could recess for just a few minutes to give her a shot to get back on, even if she can't join by video.
I'm on.
Oh, okay.
I have been all along. It's just my bandwidth keeps kicking me off.
Okay.
I'm here.
Never mind then.
You're so thoughtful, Scott.
So just continuing on with the CARES Act, again, that framework provides roughly some areas for which the money could be used for. And again, it's basically trying to respond to the COVID-19 issue here. One piece that's pretty important is that the act allows local governments to look at business grants and even housing rental assistance. And so those are very specifically listed in the CARES Act. And so I do believe there's an opportunity for council, if you're interested, to look at another round of business grants for our local businesses here as part of that program. Certainly, the staff is going to be looking at that and will present here towards the end of May. But again, the first piece of this is we got to get past the county commissioner approval on the 19th.
So I'll just jump in, Mark. Jefferson County already has theirs wrapped up. So City Council will actually see Jefferson County's CARES Act IGA this next Tuesday. So it's
and we're going to get a cup of coffee out of it, right?
It's probably about a couple 100,000. So
nice.
A few cups of coffee.
Yeah, probably should have noted this, but for Arapahoe County in total, there's $114 million that's the county received. So it is definitely sizable money. Also, there is another phase of the CARES Act that is being considered. I believe it came up here this evening that the U.S. Congress is looking at here that would be, at least in part, specifically looking at relief to local government. And so it's encouraging, but the current round cannot be used for lost revenue.
Yeah, and just jumping in regard to this 55-45 split, this is what some of the other jurisdictions are doing, like Adams County and Jefferson County. They're keeping 55, remitting 45. Just kind of as an FYI, these counties actually do not have to remit to the cities any portion of the monies that they've collected. So, the fact that we've got them to agree to remit monies is a good thing, a positive thing. But there's a lot of other jurisdictions outside of Colorado that are being left without any money. Large cities like Omaha County's taking all the money. They're not remitting any money to the city. So
Mayor and Council, that's kind of a quick update on the CARES Act. I do have probably 3 other issues I'd like to just brief the council on that I think are fairly significant.
Please.
The next is kind of the status of the Tri-County Health Department and their order. I think we probably all know by now here, of course, that their order expired here late Friday night. And so we're back under the state order. Of course, in the order, Tri-County has strongly recommended the use of face masks. And so I've asked staff to work with Tri-County and do everything we can within our means to communicate the importance and the significance of that. Also related to Tri-County Health, we have put together what we call our Main Street Plan. And this is an opportunity for us to work with Tri-County Health and the state to look at a proposal about how we can use the right-of-way and allow the businesses and restaurants and bars to access that, still maintain the safe social distancing, and that plan has been submitted. So in fact, we shared that with our RISE committee here, a meeting that we had this afternoon. There was a lot of work that went into that. That was actually a proposal that the council saw that came from our business chamber and from our Downtown Merchants Association. So we took that concept and basically ran with it. We are looking to use that as a template. Hopefully we get approval of that, at least in some level. And so we can use that as a template in other situations. We've had conversations with Aspen Grove. They've got kind of an open air market concept they are considering. We've had a couple of other businesses who want to do something very similar to that. So I think the opportunity here for the city is to help these businesses and act as as a resource to them as we try to navigate both Tri-County and the state health orders over the next several months. It's really at a disadvantage for a local business to try to do that on their own. It's a challenge for us, even as a local government. And so I think this is the opportunity for the city to kind of step up and take that role. In fact, that was the conversation at our RISE meeting here today. Let's see, I think that's my comments on the Tri-County. Reed, do you have anything to add to that?
I think the only thing I would add would just be kind of as an FYI that I know there's a lot of bars and restaurants within the city of Littleton that are trying to figure out when they might actually be able to reopen. Governor Polis said yesterday that he plans on making that decision known in the next couple of weeks. So I think specifically he said by the 25th, he would be able to provide guidance to some of those restaurants and bars in terms of when they might be able to reopen and under what sort of parameters. I think everyone can foresee that there will be some step downs in terms of limitations in terms of capacity that restaurants and bars and taverns will have to figure out. So we're still waiting to see, and we'll help provide that guidance and that information now to some of our local bars and restaurants as we get it.
Yeah, another interesting piece that I even learned here today is our staff has actually reached out to some other cities who are contemplating something similar. We're hoping to kind of share that information among ourselves here. And I think we're all trying to navigate some way through the health departments in our state. Breckenridge, the town of Breckenridge was one example I know our staff has reached out to in some of their planning. Let's see, two other topics. One of which I shared with council here, I believe this morning. You may not have had time to look at it. I mentioned this before, but we just concluded a survey of our residents here. Actually, I think that closed last night. And some of the results there are pretty fascinating because we were just asking some questions about how they've been impacted by the COVID-19. And I haven't had time to go through this in detail, but I believe it's rather telling about how our community has been challenged by this. And I do hope that this is going to provide us some good insight. So as we look to the CARES Act and how we might target some of those funds, about how the council may want to realign or take another opportunity to kind of look at that criteria to meet some of these concerns that have been expressed here in this survey. There is over 800 people responded to this. And from a survey perspective, that's a pretty significant number. And I think the individual comments I thought are really worth reading and give you great insight to our community and that challenge. So we'll probably look to our Littleton report to probably share a little bit more about this, but I do look forward to a conversation with council to kind of debrief some of that survey.
What was nice about that too, Mark, was what was it? 87% of the responders were either lived or work in Littleton.
Yeah, correct. Yeah, it was, again, my hat's off to our communications staff. They put this together pretty quickly, and we use some of our existing systems to kind of get that information out there, and specifically eConnect. And so I think that's been a great communication tool. And again, another plug for eConnect. We've been talking about that for the last couple of months, and I really do hope that our citizens, residents, and business owners take advantage of that. If you go to the city webpage and specifically under meetings, you'll see an opportunity to kind of sign up for that. But that's been a great communication tool that we've been using basically twice a week to get this information out. The last thing I just wanted to comment on is that, as the council knows, we're scheduled to make a partial opening of the Littleton Center on May 18th. And we've been working through the details of what that is. We are looking at basically a reservation opportunity. So we're not going to be taking walk-ins, but we're going to kind of push this message out here later this week. There's basically kind of 4 different areas for which we would allow citizens to make an appointment. A lot of it's around the development review. We've got some of our sales tax and utility billing kind of caught up with this. We are looking at this as an opportunity to learn. So we've taken the health orders the best we understand it, and we're trying to apply it in a sense there so that we can use the space at the Littleton Center to allow people to come in. As we've talked before, the health order, at least the current one, is being looked to expire here towards the end of the month. And so we're hoping that June brings us another level of change, another opportunity to kind of open up our buildings. And so between now, May 18th and that June date, I think is an opportunity for us to learn a lot about how we might apply some of these social distancing here within our city buildings. So that's my update, and be happy to answer any questions if council's got them.
I don't see any. Oh, Scott, and then Karina.
Mark, might there be any flexibility in that CARES Act money that we can use to do an additional round of business grants? Can any of that be used to do some recovery funding, like council discussed during our business grant program, money that we could put to renting tables and that kind of thing?
I think the short answer is probably yes. I think that the county staff, having worked with the U.S. Treasury, is trying to get some very specific direction about that. So I think the IGA that's been drafted is an opportunity for cities to kind of get pre-approval from the county. So if we come up with some questions and some projects, we can go to them and say, hey, here's what we're thinking and here's the rationale. Then they can respond to that before we actually expend any money. And so I think if we do have proposals here that we're interested in and trying to help out local businesses, quite honestly, I think that could be pretty effective.
All right, we'll go Karina. I'm sorry.
I just said that's really good news.
Oh, yeah, thank you. We'll go Karina, then Patrick.
Mark, it sounds like you already sent the Main Street plan to the county. I did see the letter from Jerry for Main Street alfresco dining. So is it something in addition to or separate than that, this Main Street plan, or is it the letter that you sent to us via email?
Let's see, it sounds like it's separate here. So I sent, I think Becky actually sent it on my behalf. So it has a letter that was addressed to the Tri-County Health Department Director, and it had a series of maps. And if you look at the maps, there was a link to these maps, and it would show you very specifically the spacing of tables, seating along Main Street.
I don't think we got that. Can you please send it to us? I don't recall seeing it. I don't know if anybody else has seen it.
Yeah.
Carol, yes, it did arrive. Becky sent it a day or so ago.
Send it to Karina one more time. If Sama can do that, that'd be great.
You betcha.
I'll look for it. Okay, thank you. And then on the eConnect, so I think, as you said, this is such, this is our way of communicating now more than ever. Is there a way to bring it more to the forefront? It's a little bit difficult to kind of find it. I've been trying to promote it, via email, via Facebook and things like that, but it takes some instruction in order for me to get them to there. So if there's a way that we can even put it on the front page of our website, I think that'll, bring those numbers up pretty darn quickly and easily for everyone.
Be happy to do that.
All right. Patrick.
This is for you or Mark. You were speaking about grants a little bit earlier. We sent out the first round of checks, I believe, last Friday. We have another 250,000, I believe. Can you give us an update as to when that next process will happen?
Well, I'm suggesting or recommending to the council that we look to the CARES Act as the next funding stream here for another round of business grants. That allows, quite honestly, a lot of flexibility and a pretty kind of robust budget. I think if we are looking at city funding, that would be probably a different story. And of course, we talked about that a couple of weeks ago, how it influences the ultimate balancing of the general fund. Again, so we'd be looking at about 4 million from the CARES Act, and I would recommend that we look towards the end of May to make some decisions about exactly how that can be used for business grants.
Well, I thought we were talking about, about 415,000 that we had available from Lyft. So we did our first mailer last Friday. So are we not going to use any of that money, any more of that money, Lyft money?
That is a policy decision of the city council. You
Okay.
cannot make a decision at that point, but you certainly could if you wanted to come back and use that funding.
Pam?
I just wanted to say that remaining funding that we have would be unrestricted, where if we wanted to do another grant, it makes sense to do what Mark is suggesting, use that for CARE grants, because the LIFT money we can use for anything. For the CARE grants, we can't. It's restricted.
Yeah, and I just to jump in on the CARE grant, any monies that were remitted that are ineligible expenses, we end up having to return that money. So it's important.
Yeah, we want to try to use it. Yeah, I do. Kelly, you're on mute.
I would like to know if we can use any of that CARES Act money to help our local nonprofits.
I think it's possible if we make a direct connection back to the results of COVID-19. In fact, that came up in the discussion between county staff and the city managers for nonprofits. If we can't simply just use it as a connection for, providing the funding for them in general, but if they can make a pitch for the connection back to COVID-19, then the answer is yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think as Ray just mentioned, when that money does finally come in, we want to find a place for that money, because if we don't use it, we lose it. It goes back. So we do want to find something. Pam and then Scott.
Has any thought been given, and I realize it's still kind of up in the air. You look at some of these comments in the surveys and how individuals are suffering. Is there anything that could be done so that money could go directly to the individuals that are just been severely impacted by unemployment or problems with childcare or those kinds of things?
That's a good question. I think there is, again, an opportunity for rent relief. I know that was some of the responses that we saw in that survey. So there may be a way to make a connection there. That I have noticed with other cities who have a housing authority connected to the city, they've used that channel to somehow address that need. In our particular case, we would have to work with South Metro Housing Options. At least that's one way to do it. I think you've identified, one of the big challenges here for us is there's not a lot of guidance in the CARES Act. And so making a connection to those who really need it is kind of our challenge here for the next few months. And that's what staff is trying to analyze at this point and come up with a recommendation.
I mean, any program would have to be something that would be easy to administer within staff time. It's just looking at maybe some options of getting it to people directly for these kinds of things. I'm sure we all know people that have really been impacted by this and can't pay their rent and trouble with groceries and things.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Scott?
Yeah, I guess this question is somewhat related to Pam's. We've talked about the possibility of using the CARES Act for business grant funding and rental relief. What are some of the other sort of major categories that we could use the money for?
Well, I think probably the most significant for us that I'm thinking of is in the retrofitting of our buildings as it relates to this issue. We have a real challenge here. Each building is so different in providing that social separation here to maintain that. And I'm sure we're all familiar, but when you start talking about retrofitting buildings, the $4 million in allocation could probably go pretty quick. I think the other big opportunity that I'm looking at is the opportunity for us to use technology to link our citizens as a response of COVID-19. I think that we just have to think differently about how that interaction is moving forward today as opposed to a couple of months ago. And I think that we've had Ashley Bolton, our IT director. I know she's kind of reviewing this, but I think there's another opportunity to kind of respond to our citizens as a result through technology.
Will we get some kind of I guess, a briefing from your office, Reed, in advance, just giving us a general outline of the CARES Act and how we can utilize that money?
It's 855 pages long if you want to send it over. Certainly. And, you know, as Tiffany spoke to earlier, the Treasury Department is coming out with kind of a guidance as this money becomes available to counties and local governments in terms of what it can be used on. So we'll certainly put together some information for council and share it probably through Mark in terms of what some of the monies can be used for. A lot of it was to kind of offset, some of it is to be used to offset expenses that, you know, the city has undertaken. So we have overtime when we have to send employees home because they've got COVID related symptoms or someone in their house does, and we're paying them for 2 weeks of them being at home. Those things are kind of the smaller things that it can be used for, but a lot of the technological improvements, the surplus things that one had to buy in order to, you know, kind of retrofit a building in terms of, are we putting up plexiglass? Are we having to put up new, you know, work units? Are we having to buy more technology for even employees to be able to function remotely? I mean, those are things that are, you know, kind of the really easy ones to identify. But going forward, looking at it strategically, Scott, I think is what you're asking. You know, what can we do with the rest of this money? And certainly, we'll put together some ideas for you.
And when, Mark, you say we can't use the money to replace lost revenues, does that mean we can't recall people from furlough if council decides to do that? Or if you as the director of the staff decides to do that?
Probably not for that single purpose, not to just bring somebody back and pay that salary. However, if we're bringing somebody back and somehow they're connected to the COVID-19 as a response, and quite honestly, we've been using some of that furloughed staff for very specific projects. That's just a challenge. To use the funds, we have to make that connection, that direct connection to COVID-19.
And financially, it gets a little bit more challenging because some of these people may have qualified for unemployment, certain things like that, and then it's probably not going to be an expense or money that can be used in that way. I don't believe, but we'll see.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. Kelly, did you have a question? Okay, cool. All right. Did Mark, you have any, is that it for your report? Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Oh, Jerry, this is Carol. I would like to do a trial summary here and see if I got it right. And that is that we were a few weeks ago talking about the possibility of using lift money to help businesses. And Mark was saying at that point that we might have some federal money or money from other sources. We didn't know then. And we might use that instead. And now we have found out that we have the CARES money. And so it makes sense to use that money since it will be targeted directly toward alleviating COVID-related problems and not use the lift money for that. Did I get that right? Mark?
That is my recommendation.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Carol, that's something that I thought would be prudent.
Great.
Yeah.
All right. Well, once Reed reads the 800 and some odd pages, just get back to us. What, Friday?
855.
5? Okay. All right.
We have a 50-word summary of that.
Reed, do you have a?
I'll put it in a haiku. Pardon, Mayor?
Reed? Yeah, I said, do you have a report for us?
No, I was just going to piggyback on what Mark was saying and jump in during his time. So I'm good.
Okay, cool. The one thing for council, with the exception of last Tuesday, our regular meeting, which was packed with information, we've had a fairly light year. But I think now, as things, as we all start to get a handle on opening up and what Mark can do going forward, I think the schedule is going to get filled real quick. Because if you look at the schedule right now, there's a lot of openings in it. So, Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, I think you're going to start stacking that schedule with item after item. So we might finally get busy again, which we haven't been really for a whole year. So I'm looking forward to it.
Yes, I think council will be earning their pay here pretty quick. We have next week a pretty modest regular meeting. We do have a couple of second readings here on some ordinances, but I think they're for the most part pretty straightforward. So we took the opportunity to add a study session after the regular meeting here, and we're going to be connecting with Brett Keast and talking through a series of policy issues related to our code work. We had talked about this, I think, a little over a week ago. And so next week is going to be a pretty robust evening in total. The week after that, then we have a study session here, and we've got a couple of topics, and we've had a couple of council requests some issues here. We've got, trying to remember, Reed, help me remember the total. What was the first item we had on there?
The special districts.
Oh, special districts. That's what it was. We've got a request to talk about the lodging tax and a solid waste issue. And so per the council protocols, those last two, that's a decision here or a discussion with council about whether or not to move it forward with any further discussion. And so that meeting should be pretty robust as well. And then June, we're starting to fill in here.
And you also are going to have a CARES update as well.
Yeah, correct. That's, yeah, of course. That is the big target, is getting the CARES Act before the council so we can act quickly on that one. And specifically, it's the business grant piece. I think we need to timely act on that piece of it. And so June now is starting to fill in as well. So the balance of May is going to be pretty busy here.
Great. So I just reminded council, look at that schedule when it comes out. And it changes. It's going to be changing, I think, over the next few weeks quickly. Council, do you have anything else? If we have no more business, it is 8:11. And we are adjourned.
Okay.
Have a good night.